The first punch split Jovita's lip open. Blood filled her mouth, hot and metallic. Her knees hit the wet pavement with a crack that sent pain shooting up her thighs. Rain pelted her face, mixing with the tears she couldn't stop. Through blurred vision, she saw two men towering over her. One had a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, its forked tongue flicking toward his jaw. Both wore smiles that promised worse was coming. "You work for Kong Day One," Snake Tattoo said, his accent thick and Eastern European. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back until she was forced to look up at him. Perfect message. Her thin coat was already soaked through, doing nothing to shield her from the November chill. The alley smelled of garbage and something rotting. Water pooled around her knees, soaking into her worn uniform pants, the gray ones with the small insignia of Day One's household embroidered on the pocket. The same insignia that had caught their attention. "Please," Jovita whispered, the word garbled by her swelling lip. "I just clean his house. I don't know him. I'm nobody." The second man laughed, the sound bouncing off the brick walls that hemmed them in. "That's not what our boss says. He says everyone who works for Day One is valuable." Snake Tattoo's grip tightened in her hair. "Especially pretty ones." The second punch caught her in the ribs. Pain exploded through her chest, stealing her breath. She tried to curl inward, to protect herself, but rough hands held her in place. "Our boss will enjoy hearing how you screamed," Snake Tattoo whispered. Jovita thought of her brother waiting at home. Steve, with his missing leg and his smile that somehow hadn't dimmed despite everything. Steve, who only had her left in this world. "I can't die here," she thought desperately. "Not in an alley. Not 4 blocks from a penthouse worth more than my entire life. Not where no one will find me until morning. Not where no one will even notice I'm gone." The third punch made everything go dark around the edges. The fourth blurred into the fifth. She stopped counting after that, retreating deep inside herself as her body absorbed the blows. She didn't know then that someone would notice her absence. That someone would care. That her blood spilled on that pavement would start a war that would shake Seoul to its foundations. That Kong Day One would tear the city apart looking for the men who had dared to touch what he considered his. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story with me, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because, trust me, tomorrow I'm bringing you another story that's going to hit just as hard as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, back to the story. For 19 months, Jovita Hale had been nothing but a ghost in Kong Day One's world. She had perfected the art of invisibility. Her hands polished surfaces so pristine she could see her reflection in them. Arranged orchids that cost more than her monthly rent. Folded sheets softer than anything she'd ever slept on. 40 floors above Seoul in a penthouse that sprawled like a small country, Jovita existed as nothing more than a shadow. A pair of hands that made everything perfect. A presence that disappeared the moment footsteps approached. She knew Day One's schedule better than he probably knew it himself. When he woke at 5:30 a.m., she made sure fresh coffee was brewing but that she was nowhere near the kitchen. When he spent time in his office between 9 and 11, she cleaned the other side of the penthouse. When he took calls in the living room, she found reasons to work in the bedrooms. Jovita knew the weight of his footsteps on marble, heavy, deliberate, commanding. She knew the scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something darker that lingered in rooms after he'd left. She knew he drank his coffee black in the morning but preferred tea with honey at night. What she didn't know was his face. Not really. In 19 months, she had caught only glimpses. Dark hair always perfectly styled. Sharp jawline that looked carved from stone. A thin scar along his left eyebrow. And his eyes, gray like the sky before a storm, cold enough to freeze anyone who dared to hold his gaze. Jovita never dared. The rules had been made clear on her first day by Una Park, Day One's sister and the household manager. There are 3 rules. 1. You see nothing. 2. You hear nothing. 3. You are nothing. Jovita had nodded. With $151,000 in debt crushing her shoulders, she would have agreed to anything. My brother values his privacy above all else, Yuna had continued. If he enters a room, you leave it. If he is on a call, you disappear. If he speaks to you directly, which he won't, you answer with as few words as possible. She had taken those rules and built her life around them. Moving through the palatial penthouse like mist. Learning which floors creaked. Which doors closed silently. How to time her tasks so perfectly that for 19 months, she and Kang Dae-won had existed in the same space without truly acknowledging each other. It was a dance she had mastered out of necessity. Because $151,000 in debt doesn't leave room for mistakes. The penthouse was her first job of the day. From 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, she cleaned rooms larger than the entire apartment she shared with Steve. Then she took the subway across the city to wait tables at a noodle shop until 9. On weekends, she cleaned office buildings until her hands cracked and bled. She slept on subway trains between shifts. Ate leftover food from the restaurant. Learned to survive on 4 hours of sleep and pure, stubborn determination. While Daewon's world gleamed with wealth and power, Jovita's crumbled under the weight of hospital bills and creditor calls. She organized his designer suits while wearing the same 3 outfits she'd had for years. Arranged fresh flowers in his bathroom that cost more than the medicine keeping her brother alive. If Kang Dae-won had a heart, she'd never seen evidence of it. He moved through his perfect world like an emperor, surrounded by people who jumped at his command, feared his displeasure, catered to his every need. Until the night she was attacked in that alley, she hadn't thought he even knew her name. The next thing Jovita remembered after those punches was waking up in a room she'd cleaned 1,000 times but never slept in. Pain pulsed through every inch of her body. Her ribs felt like they were on fire. Her face throbbed with a deep, persistent ache. The taste of copper still lingered in her mouth. Slowly, she became aware of the silk sheets against her skin. The delicate patterns carved into the ceiling that she dusted every week. The soft glow of a lamp that cost more than her brother's prosthetic. And then she realized she wasn't alone. Kang Dae-won sat beside the bed, watching her with an expression that made her blood run cold. His suit jacket was gone, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscled forearms. A thin silver watch caught the light as he leaned forward, his gray eyes locked on hers. "Who did this to you?" he asked. His voice was soft, but there was nothing gentle about it. It was the softness of a blade before it cuts. Jovita tried to speak, but her throat closed up. In 19 months, he had never directly addressed her. Had never looked at her as though she were anything more than furniture. Now he was staring at her like she was the only person in the world, his eyes burning with something dark and dangerous. That's when she realized she was no longer invisible. And that terrified her more than the men in the alley ever had. 3 years ago, Jovita's life was normal. She remembered how it felt, that normality. The cramped 2-room apartment in Siademan she'd shared with her mother and Steve. The small balcony where she'd kept a row of potted herbs, basil, mint, rosemary, lined up against the railing to catch the morning sun. The fashion design textbook stacked on her desk, filled with her sketches and dreams. She had been 24 then. Working at a small restaurant to save for design school. Staying up late sketching clothing patterns by the dim light of a desk lamp. Planning a future where her creations would hang in boutique windows. Her mother had been the center of that small, hopeful world. Song Mi-hae had raised her children alone after their father disappeared when Jovita was 12. She worked at a textile factory, her fingers always stained with dye, her back perpetually bent from leaning over industrial sewing machines for 14 hours a day. But those hands, those strong, capable hands, had always moved with certainty. They braided Jovita's hair every morning before school. Patched Steve's pants when he tore them climbing trees. Prepared kimchi in massive batches every autumn, fingers red from chili paste but never faltering. Until the day they did. It started with a teacup. Songmi had been pouring her morning barley tea when the cup slipped from her grasp, shattering against the floor. She had laughed it off. Just getting clumsy in my old age, she said, though she was only 49. Then it was a button she couldn't fasten. A pen that kept dropping from her fingers. The chopsticks that suddenly felt too heavy to hold steady. The tremors grew worse. Spread from her hands to her arms. Her balance faltered. Her speech slurred. Degenerative myelopathy. Progressive. Terminal. The doctors used words Jovita couldn't pronounce while her mother's hands, the same hands that had held Jovita through every storm, slowly stopped obeying her. For 18 months, Jovita watched her mother disappear inside her own body. Fed her when she couldn't hold a spoon. Bathed her when she couldn't stand. Read to her when her vision blurred. The hospital bills reached $89,000 by the time Songmi closed her eyes for the last time. But fate wasn't done with the Hales. Steve was 20. Brilliant. Full scholarship to engineering school. The one who was supposed to make it. Coming home from a late study session, he'd crossed the street at the wrong moment. The drunk driver had been going too fast to stop. The impact shattered his left leg beyond repair. Amputation. Prosthetic. Physical therapy he desperately needed but they couldn't afford. Another $62,000 added to Jovita's mountain of debt. $151,000 total. The number haunted her dreams. Followed her through her waking hours. Pressed down on her chest until some nights she woke gasping for breath. The restaurant job wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. That's when she saw the listing. Housekeeper needed. Penthouse residence. Premium compensation. Discretion required. It was printed on expensive cardstock, posted discreetly in the window of an upscale employment agency in Gangnam. The kind of place Jovita had never dared to enter before desperation pushed her through its doors. The address listed was in the most exclusive high-rise in Seoul. The salary was triple what she made at the restaurant. The phrase, discretion required, should have been her first warning. But $151,000 in debt doesn't leave room for warnings. The lobby of the Hanul Tower gleamed like it was built from liquid silver. Marble floors polished to mirror shine. Crystal chandeliers hanging from 30-foot ceilings. A waterfall wall that whispered rather than roared. Jovita felt like an intruder in her best outfit, a navy blue skirt suit she'd bought secondhand and tailored herself. Her resume, printed on the cheapest paper from the convenience store, seemed pathetic in her hands. The receptionist looked at her with the practiced blankness of someone trained to judge without appearing to. 44th floor, she said after a brief call. Ms. Park is expecting you. The elevator had no buttons. Just a panel where the receptionist swiped a key card before stepping back. The doors closed, and Jovita felt her stomach drop as it shot upward. 44 floors. Straight to the top. When the doors opened, Jovita stepped into another world. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Seoul sprawled beneath her like a glittering carpet. The Han River curved like a ribbon of silver. Mountains rose in the distance, hazy and blue. A woman waited in the center of the foyer. Una Park had the kind of beauty that felt engineered rather than natural, perfect symmetry, flawless skin, not a hair out of place in her sleek black bob. She wore a charcoal gray pantsuit that probably cost more than Jovita's yearly rent. Her posture was military straight, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted. Her eyes, though. Her eyes were winter, cold, assessing, unyielding. Jovita Hale, she said. Not a question. Her voice reminded Jovita of cut glass, clear, precise, with edges that could draw blood. Yes. Follow me. No introduction. No small talk. Just a command. Yuna led her through the penthouse. Each room they passed was more beautiful than the last. White marble floors. Furniture that looked like art. Windows that made walls unnecessary. They ended in a small office with a view of Namsan Tower. Yuna gestured for Jovita to sit in a chair opposite a minimalist desk. Your resume says you've never worked as household staff before. Again, not a question. I haven't, Jovita admitted. But I'm a fast learner. I've been caring for my mother and brother for years. I know how to clean, organize, prepare simple meals. Yuna held up one perfectly manicured hand. Your domestic skills are not my primary concern. She leaned forward slightly, those winter eyes examining Jovita with disturbing thoroughness. This position is unique. My brother requires absolute privacy and discretion. The person who fills this role must understand boundaries. Your brother? Jovita hadn't realized she would be working for a family. Kang Dae-won. Yuna said the name as if it should mean something. And maybe it should have. Maybe if Jovita hadn't spent the last 2 years in hospitals and pharmacies, she would have recognized it. Would have understood why Yuna's gaze sharpened, watching for her reaction. But all Jovita felt was confusion. Something in her lack of recognition seemed to please Yuna. She nodded once, decision made. There are 3 rules, she said, voice cool and final. 1. You see nothing. 2. You hear nothing. 3. You are nothing. Jovita blinked. I don't understand. My brother conducts business from his home. Sensitive business. You will clean around meetings without appearing to listen. You will enter rooms where documents may be visible without reading them. You will hear conversations that never took place. A chill ran down Jovita's spine. What kind of job was this? Dae-won values his privacy above all else, Yuna continued. If he enters a room, you leave it. If he is on a call, you disappear. If he speaks to you directly, which he won't, you answer with as few words as possible. Jovita hesitated. Every instinct told her to leave. To run from whatever this was. But then she thought of Steve, trying to do physical therapy exercises from YouTube videos because they couldn't afford a specialist. Of the debt collectors who called daily. Of the second notice on their electricity bill. I understand, she said quietly. Yuna's expression didn't change, but something in her posture eased slightly. The salary is as advertised. Paid weekly. You will work Monday through Friday, 6 to 2. You will have access to the service entrance and elevator only. You will wear the uniform provided. You will never bring personal items into the penthouse except your identification. She slid a contract across the desk. Sign this. Non-disclosure agreement. Breaking it has consequences. The way she said consequences made Jovita's mouth go dry. But she signed. What choice did she have? Her first day was a revelation in terror. The uniform was simple, charcoal gray pants and a matching polo shirt with a small insignia embroidered on the chest. Jovita recognized it as a stylized Korean character, but couldn't read which one. The penthouse was even larger than her tour had suggested. 4 bedrooms. 5 bathrooms. A kitchen that could serve a restaurant. A dining room that could seat 20. A living area divided into 3 distinct spaces. An office with doors that looked thick enough to stop bullets. Yuna gave her a schedule. Clean the east wing from 6 to 8. Dae-won will be in the gym. Kitchen from 8 to 9. He'll be in the shower. Living area from 9 to 11. He'll be in the office. No overlap. Never in the same space. The entire design was to ensure Jovita remained invisible. She wasn't prepared for how difficult that would be. The first time she heard footsteps approaching, heavy, deliberate, commanding, she froze. Heart pounding, dustcloth in hand, she looked around desperately for somewhere to go. The footsteps drew closer. The door to the room was the only exit. Panicking, she ducked behind a massive jade plant in a corner. The footsteps entered the room. Paused. Through the leaves, she caught her first glimpse of her employer. Kang Dae-won was tall, taller than she'd expected. His black hair was swept back from a face that seemed carved rather than born. Sharp cheekbones. Stronger jaw. A thin scar along his left eyebrow that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than flawed. He wore a gray suit that fit him like armor. No tie. The top button of his white shirt undone. A watch on his wrist that probably cost more than all the medical equipment keeping Steve alive. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. Gray like the sky before a storm. Cold and deep and somehow ancient in a face that couldn't have been more than 35. They swept the room slowly, methodically, as if cataloging every object, every shadow. For one terrifying moment, they passed over her hiding spot. She was certain he could hear her heart beating. But then he turned, lifted a phone to his ear, and began speaking in rapid Japanese. Jovita didn't move until long after he'd left the room. That night, she told Yuna what had happened. Expected to be fired on the spot. Instead, Yuna's mouth tightened into something that wasn't quite disappointment. Next time, leave before he enters. If you can't, stay where you are and don't move. Don't breathe. Don't exist. He notices movement, not stillness. From that day forward, Jovita learned to predict his movements by sound alone. The weight of his footsteps on marble. The creak of his office chair. The soft click of his lighter when he smoked on the balcony late at night. She built a mental map of his routines. When he woke. When he exercised. When he took calls. When he left the penthouse in his black Bentley. When he returned, sometimes with blood on his cuffs that she was expected to clean without comment. She learned to feel his presence like an animal senses a predator, not through sight or sound but through some primal instinct that raised the hair on the back of her neck. For 19 months, she became so good at being invisible that sometimes she wondered if she was disappearing in real life too. If someday she would look in the mirror and see nothing at all. While she cleaned his life, hers fell apart piece by piece. Steve's physical therapy sessions became less frequent as the money ran out. The debt collectors grew more aggressive. Their apartment's heating worked only sporadically through the coldest winter in decades. Jovita added 2 more jobs. Waiting tables at a noodle shop after leaving the penthouse. Cleaning office buildings on weekends. She slept on subway trains between shifts. Ate leftover food from the restaurant. Learned to survive on 4 hours of sleep and pure, stubborn determination. The contrast between her 2 worlds became almost hallucinatory. She organized Dae-won's designer clothes while wearing the same 3 outfits she'd had for years. She arranged fresh flowers in his bathroom that cost more than the medicine keeping her brother alive. She dusted bookshelves filled with first editions while her own design textbooks gathered dust, dreams deferred by necessity. Sometimes, on her hands and knees scrubbing his marble floors, she wondered what it would be like to matter to someone with his kind of power. What it would be like to be seen by those storm-gray eyes. To be valued instead of made invisible. But those were dangerous thoughts. If Kang Dae-won had a heart, she'd never seen evidence of it. He moved through his perfect world like an emperor, surrounded by people who jumped at his command, feared his displeasure, catered to his every need. The blood she sometimes cleaned from his shirts. The hushed phone calls in languages she didn't understand. The men who entered his office looking confident and left looking haunted. They all told her what kind of man he was. A man whose name was whispered, never shouted. A man whose business existed in shadows. A man who had never once acknowledged her presence in 19 months of perfect service. Until the night he found her bleeding on the street, and something inside him, something primal and terrifying, finally woke up. Something that made her realize that being invisible had been her only protection. And now that protection was gone. Jovita's mother had hands that never stopped moving. That's what she remembered most clearly. Not the woman's face, which time had begun to blur in her memory, but those hands, constantly in motion, creating, fixing, caring. Song-mi Hale's fingers had been slender but strong, stained permanently blue-black at the tips from years working at the textile factory. They'd smelled of ginger and sesame oil when she cooked, of lavender soap when she braided Jovita's hair, of earth when she tended the small plants on their apartment balcony. Those hands had held Jovita through every childhood fever, had wiped away tears after her father disappeared, had taught her how to thread a needle and transform flat fabric into something beautiful. They'd worked 14-hour shifts at the factory, then come home to cook dinner, mend clothes, and somehow still find energy to help with homework. Your hands tell your story, Song-mi often said, examining Jovita's fingers with a gentle touch. Keep them busy with good work, and they'll make you proud. The tremors started so subtly that Jovita almost missed them. A teacup rattling against its saucer. A button that took 3 attempts to fasten. Rice grains spilled across the kitchen counter. Just getting old, her mother laughed when Jovita pointed it out. She was only 49. But age wasn't the culprit. The tremors grew worse over weeks, then months. Spread from her fingers to her hands, then up her arms. Her balance faltered. Her speech slurred at the end of long sentences. The woman who had never needed help with anything suddenly couldn't open a jar of kimchi. The diagnosis came after tests Jovita couldn't pronounce and specialists they couldn't afford. Degenerative myelopathy. A disease that attacked the nervous system, destroying the connections between brain and body. Progressive. Incurable. Terminal. How long? Jovita had asked the doctor while her mother sat stoically beside her, hands trembling in her lap. 1 to 2 years, he'd said with practiced sympathy. With proper care. Proper care meant specialized equipment. Home modifications. Medications to manage symptoms. A hospital bed for when her muscles could no longer support her. Nursing assistance for when things got worse. None of which their insurance would cover. The first bill was $10,000. Then $25,000. Then $50,000. Jovita dropped out of design school. Took a second job. Moved them to a cheaper apartment. Cut every expense she could think of. Still, the debt grew. As relentlessly as the disease. For 18 months, she watched her mother disappear inside her own body piece by piece. Those once nimble hands became rigid, useless claws. The voice that had sung lullabies became a slurred whisper. The woman who had carried the family now needed to be carried from bed to bathroom. Jovita became everything: nurse, provider, housekeeper, cook. She learned to change adult diapers. To prevent bed sores. To feed someone who couldn't swallow properly. To interpret needs from expressions when words failed. She slept on a cot beside her mother's hospital bed, installed in what had once been their small living room. Woke to every moan, every labored breath. Held those once strong hands as they grew thinner, weaker, until they felt like bird bones beneath paper skin. "I'm sorry," her mother whispered one night, words barely distinguishable. "You shouldn't have to." "Don't," Jovita had said fiercely, pressing her forehead against her mother's. "You've carried me my whole life. Let me carry you now." The night Song-mi died was unnaturally quiet. No traffic outside their window. No neighbors arguing through the thin walls. Just the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine and her mother's increasingly shallow breaths. Jovita had been reading to her, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, her mother's favorite. She'd looked up from the page to find Songmi watching her with perfect clarity, as if the disease had momentarily released its grip. "My beautiful girl," she'd whispered, suddenly sounding like herself again. "You'll be okay." Then she'd closed her eyes and simply stopped breathing. The hospital bills reached $89,000 by the time they cremated Songmi's body. Jovita thought the worst had happened. That nothing could hurt more than watching her mother's body betray her, than feeling those once strong hands go limp in hers. She was wrong. Steve was 20. Brilliant and undaunted. He'd won a full scholarship to Seoul National University's engineering program despite attending an underfunded high school. Had a mind that could solve equations Jovita couldn't begin to understand. Had their mother's determination and their father's height. "I'm going to design prosthetics someday," he'd told Jovita a week after their mother's funeral. "Affordable ones. So people don't have to choose between walking and eating." He'd always been like that, seeing a path forward when all Jovita could see were walls. He took the night classes so he could help with their mother during the day. Studied on the subway. Did homework between her care sessions. Never complained, even when exhaustion left dark circles under his eyes. When Songmi died, he'd held Jovita while she cried, then gently pushed her toward the bathroom to shower. "Mom would want us to keep going," he'd said simply. And they had. Jovita working double shifts to pay down the medical debt. Steve throwing himself into his studies, determined to build them a better future. Until the night a drunk driver ran a red light at 2 a.m. Steve had been crossing the street after a late study session at the library. The impact threw him 30 feet. The car never stopped. Jovita got the call at 3:17 a.m. The hospital was different from her mother's. Brighter. Louder. Smelling of antiseptic rather than despair. They'd already taken Steve to surgery when she arrived. All she could do was wait, watching fluorescent lights flicker overhead and listening to the squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum. The surgeon found her 6 hours later. "We couldn't save the leg," he said, his face grave but kind. "The damage was too extensive. But he's young, healthy. He'll adapt." Amputation. Above the left knee. Jovita had nodded, thanked him, asked practical questions about recovery. Had walked calmly to the bathroom before locking herself in a stall and silently screaming until her throat burned. When Steve woke, groggy and confused, she was beside him, composure perfectly reconstructed. "Bad news," she'd said, forcing lightness into her voice. "You've lost your standing as Seoul's most handsome man. Now you're only second place." He'd blinked at her, then down at the sheet covering what remained of his left leg. "Does this mean I get discounted shoes?" he'd whispered hoarsely. And they'd laughed, a desperate, broken sound that somehow kept them both from shattering completely. The bills started immediately. Surgery. Hospital stay. Prosthetic fitting. Physical therapy. Another $62,000 added to the $89,000 they already owed. $151,000 total. A number so large it stopped being real. Became instead a weight pressing on her chest, stealing her breath at night, following her through each waking hour. Jovita took a third job. Slept less. Ate less. Moved them to an even smaller apartment. Just one room with a shared bathroom down the hall. It wasn't accessible, but it was all they could afford. She learned to help Steve navigate the 3 narrow steps to their door. To bandage the sores that formed where his prosthetic met his residual limb. To massage the phantom pain from muscles that no longer existed. What she couldn't afford was proper physical therapy. The kind that might have helped him walk without pain. The kind that insurance denied and hospitals demanded payment for upfront. Instead, Steve taught himself from YouTube videos. Practice balance exercises holding onto their wobbly kitchen table. Did strength training with water bottles filled with sand. And through it all, he smiled. told terrible jokes. Never blamed her for the cramped apartment or the cheap prosthetic that rubbed his skin raw or the fact that his brilliant mind was trapped in a body that had betrayed him. "We're still here," he'd say on the days when Jovita's exhaustion turned to tears. "That's not nothing." Jovita worked 3 jobs. The penthouse from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Then the noodle shop until 9. Office buildings on weekends until midnight. She moved through her life like a ghost. Sleeping on subway trains between shifts, her body so tired it could find rest pressed against hard plastic seats and jostled by strangers. Eating leftover food from the restaurant, sometimes standing in the kitchen after closing, shoveling cold noodles into her mouth before rushing to her next job. She survived on 4 hours of sleep and pure, stubborn determination. Some days, the exhaustion was so complete she found herself crying while folding day one's Egyptian cotton sheets, silent tears she couldn't explain or stop. Other days, a strange euphoria would overtake her, a lightheadedness that made the world seem slightly unreal, like she was floating just above her own life. The debt never shrank. Instead, it grew with interest rates that should have been illegal. With late fees when she couldn't quite make the minimum payment. With new medications Steve needed when his stump became infected from the ill-fitting prosthetic. Sometimes, Jovita caught herself staring at the prescription pills they kept for Steve's pain. Wondering how many it would take to make everything stop. To finally rest. But then she'd think of her brother, waiting in their tiny apartment, doing his exercises, never complaining, still believing they would get through this somehow. And she'd swallow the despair, push it down deep where he wouldn't see it, and keep going. One foot in front of the other. One day at a time. One breath followed by another. She had become so accustomed to being unseen, to carrying weights no one else could see, that she'd stopped expecting help. Stopped believing in anything but her own capacity to endure. That Thursday night in November, she was so tired she didn't notice the black van until it was too late. Didn't see the men until they were right in front of her. "You work for Kong Day one said, grinning. "Our boss wants to send him a message." The first punch knocked her down. The second broke something inside her. By the third, she was thinking only of Steve, waiting at home, who had no one else in the world. The last thing she remembered was rain mixing with blood on the pavement, and a car stopping nearby, headlights cutting through the darkness. She didn't know then that being invisible had been her only protection. And that being seen by Kong Day One would change everything. Consciousness came to Jovita in fragments. Rain on her face. Cold drops sliding down her temples, mixing with something warm and sticky. Blood, she realized distantly. Movement. Her body cradled against something solid and warm. The sensation of being carried. Pain. Everywhere. Her ribs screaming with each breath. Her face throbbing. Something sharp and relentless drilling into her skull. A scent enveloped her. Expensive cologne, sandalwood and something darker. A scent she'd cleaned from shirts and smoothed from bedsheets for 19 months. Through swollen eyes, she forced her lids open just enough to see a blur of lights and shadow. Then, a silhouette came into focus, broad shoulders, sharp jawline, a face carved from angles rather than curves. Kong Day One was carrying her. Not his driver. Not his security. Him. His arms were steel bands around her body, holding her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, dripping down the severe lines of his face. His jaw was clenched tight enough that she could see a muscle ticking beneath the skin. "Who did this to you?" His voice rumbled against her ear, vibrating through his chest and into hers. Jovita tried to answer, but her tongue felt thick and useless in her mouth. Her lips cracked painfully when she attempted to form words. Those storm-gray eyes locked onto hers for one electric moment. Something flashed in their depths, anger, yes, but something else too. Something she couldn't name. Before she could make sense of it, darkness pulled her under again. The next time Jovita opened her eyes, confusion hit her before pain could reassert itself. Silk sheets against her skin, cool and impossibly smooth. A ceiling above her, not the water-stained panels of her apartment, but one carved with intricate patterns she'd dusted weekly. Soft light filtered through gauzy curtains she'd hung herself during her second month of employment. She was lying in a bed she'd made 100 times but never slept in. The guest suite of day one's penthouse, with its hand-woven rug from Tibet and its view of Nam San Tower. Panic surged through her. She tried to sit up, but agony ripped through her ribs, stealing her breath. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice came from beside her. Not day one's. Calmer. Gentler. Jovita turned her head slowly, wincing as the movement sent fresh pain shooting through her skull. A man sat in a chair pulled close to the bed. Dr. Jean, day one's personal physician. She'd seen him a few times during her cleaning shifts, always coming or going with a discreet black medical bag. Middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair neatly styled, calm eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses, steady hands that now reached toward her wrist to check her pulse. "2 broken ribs," he said when he saw she was fully awake. His voice was warm honey, soothing in its professional certainty. "Concussion. Extensive bruising across your torso and face. Your left eye was nearly swollen shut, but the ice has helped. No internal bleeding, which is fortunate given the force of the blows." He peered into her eyes with a small light, checking her pupils. "You're lucky," he concluded, sitting back. Lucky wasn't the word she would have chosen. "Where am I?" Her voice sounded wrong, scraped raw from screaming she didn't remember. "Day one's private quarters," Dr. Jean said, placing the light back in his bag. He insisted. Jovita tried to process this information. For 19 months, she'd been forbidden from even being in the same room as her employer. Now she was in his private wing of the penthouse? In a bed worth more than everything she owned? "My brother," she managed, pushing through the pain to form the words. "He's alone. He needs me." "Mr. Kong is aware of your situation," Dr. Jean said, his expression softening slightly. "He's handling it." Before Jovita could ask what that meant, the doctor stood and gathered his bag. "I've given you something for the pain. It will make you drowsy, but that's good. Rest is what you need most right now." He moved toward the door. "Mr. Kong wanted to be informed when you woke. He'll be in shortly." Panic flared again, stronger this time. 19 months of avoiding day one's gaze, of slipping from rooms when he entered, of making herself invisible, and now she was trapped in a bed, unable to escape the conversation she'd spent over a year avoiding. Dr. Jean left, closing the door with a soft click that felt oddly final. Jovita took inventory of herself. Someone had changed her clothes. She now wore a soft cotton t-shirt that hung loosely on her frame. Her face felt clean, her hair damp but no longer matted with blood and rain. Her ribs were tightly wrapped under the shirt. Every movement sent pain radiating through her body, but the edges were dulled, likely from whatever medication Dr. Jean had administered. The door opened again before she could attempt to sit up. Kong Dae-won filled the doorway like a storm front. No suit today, just black pants and a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and a watch that probably cost more than her entire life's earnings. For 19 months, she'd avoided his gaze. Now, she couldn't escape it. He entered the room with deliberate steps, each footfall familiar to her after months of tracking his movements by sound alone. He didn't take the chair Dr. Jean had vacated. Instead, he stood at the foot of the bed, hands clasped behind his back, eyes never leaving her face. "The men who did this," he said, voice deceptively soft. The kind of softness that hid sharpness beneath. "Did they say anything?" Jovita swallowed, her throat dry and painful. "Water," she whispered. Without hesitation, Dae-won moved to the bedside table, poured from a crystal carafe, and held the glass to her lips. His hands were surprisingly gentle, supporting her head as she drank. The incongruity of it, this powerful man performing such an intimate, caring gesture, made her dizzy in a way that had nothing to do with her concussion. When she finished, he set the glass down and repeated, "What did they say?" She met his eyes, truly met them for the first time, and saw something burning there that made her pulse quicken. "They mentioned a boss," she said, her voice steadier after the water. "Said they were sending you a message." "Did they give a name?" Each word precise, controlled, but with an undercurrent of something lethal. "No." She closed her eyes briefly, trying to recall details through the fog of pain and medication. One had an accent. Eastern European maybe. And a tattoo. A snake on his neck. Something flickered in Daewon's eyes. Something dangerous. "Park Min-ho," he said, almost to himself. Stupid move. The name meant nothing to Jovita, but the way Daewon said it, like a death sentence, sent a chill through her. Reality suddenly reasserted itself. Steve would be waiting, wondering where she was, unable to easily care for himself. Jovita tried to sit up, pain shooting through her ribs. "I need to go. My brother. Your brother is being taken care of." Her heart stopped. What? Steve Hale. 20. Lives in Sea Demon. Prosthetic left leg. He recited the facts like he was reading a file, each detail perfect. "He's being brought here tomorrow." Jovita stared at him, confusion and fear battling inside her. "What do you mean, brought here?" "Exactly what I said." Daewon's expression remained unreadable. "I've sent Sungmin to collect him and his belongings. He'll stay here while you recover." "You can't just," she started, then stopped, because apparently he could. And had. "Why?" she asked instead. "Why would you do that?" Something shifted in his expression, the barest softening around his eyes. "Because you cannot take care of him in your condition, and he cannot take care of himself. The logical solution is to bring him here, where both of you can be properly attended to." He said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. As if bringing the brother of his housekeeper to his penthouse after she'd been beaten in an alley was simply a matter of logistics. "How do you know about my brother?" she whispered. The question seemed to surprise him. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and for a brief moment, he looked almost amused. Then Daewon stepped closer to the bed, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the nearly invisible scar along his left eyebrow, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. Close enough that his scent, that familiar sandalwood, enveloped her again. "Jovita," he said, her name sounding strange on his lips, as if he'd practiced it in private but rarely spoken it aloud. "Did you really think I didn't know exactly who was moving through my home for the past 19 months? His gaze held hers, unflinching and direct. "I know that you sleep on subway trains between jobs. I know that you work at Min's Noodle House until 9, and that you clean the Jangwon building on weekends. I know that you owe $151,000 in medical debt, $89,000 for your mother's treatment and $62,000 for your brother's." He continued, each word precise and calm. "I know that you were studying fashion design before your mother fell ill. That you still sketch clothing patterns on napkins during your breaks. That you sing to yourself when you think no one is listening, always the same 3 songs your mother taught you." Jovita couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt around her. "How?" she managed. "I make it my business to know who enters my home," he said simply. "Who cleans my spaces? Who touches my things?" His voice lowered slightly on the last word, sending an inexplicable shiver down her spine. "But you never." She struggled to find words. "You always acted like I wasn't there." "That was the arrangement," he said. "The rules Yuna set. The boundaries that kept things simple. The way he said, simple, made her think there was nothing simple about it at all. So I was never actually invisible, she whispered, more to herself than to him. His expression changed then, something flickering in his eyes that looked almost like regret. No, Jovita, he said softly. You were never invisible to me. And that's when she realized, all those months of slipping from rooms, of timing her cleaning to avoid him, of holding her breath when he passed, they had been a performance for an audience that was always watching. She had never been unseen. She had only been unseen in the ways that mattered. The wheels of Steve's chair made a soft sound against the marble floors of Day One's penthouse, a whisper of rubber on stone that seemed impossibly loud in the vast entrance hall. Jovita watched her brother from the doorway of the guest suite, leaning heavily against the frame for support. Her ribs screamed in protest at being upright, but nothing could have kept her in bed once Una told her Steve had arrived. Her brother looked small in this space, this kingdom of marble and glass, where every object cost more than their entire apartment. His eyes were wide, darting from the crystal chandelier overhead to the massive abstract paintings on the walls, to the sweeping view of Seoul through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He wore the same faded blue hoodie he'd had for years, the same worn jeans cut off at the left knee to accommodate his prosthetic. Behind him stood a man Jovita recognized as Sung Min, one of Day One's drivers. He carried 2 shabby duffel bags, everything her brother owned in the world, and looked vaguely uncomfortable, as if unsure where to set them down in this pristine environment. When Steve spotted her, his face transformed. Relief, then shock, then something close to horror as he took in her injuries. Jovi, he breathed, wheeling toward her with quick, practiced movements. My God. She tried to smile, but her split lip made it a grimace. It looks worse than it is. Up close, she could see the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. He hadn't slept. Had probably spent the night terrified, waiting for her to come home, imagining the worst. And the worst had almost happened. Steve reached for her hand, gripping it tightly as his eyes catalogued every injury. The bruising around her left eye, now faded to sickly yellows and greens. The stitches at her temple where she'd hit the pavement. The careful way she held herself to avoid jarring her broken ribs. He started to cry. Not loud sobs, but silent tears that slipped down his cheeks, his face crumpling like it had the day their mother died. Who did this to you? He demanded, his voice rough with emotion. He squeezed her fingers, his eyes fierce despite the tears. The truth, Jovi. Not whatever lie you're planning to tell me to make it sound less awful. Jovita glanced past her brother. Day One stood in the hallway behind him, watching their reunion with that unreadable expression of his. Their eyes met over Steve's head, and something passed between them, a question from her, a barely perceptible nod from him. Permission to share a version of the truth. Some men attacked me after work, she said carefully, looking back at her brother. I was walking to the subway. They wanted my bag, but then they saw my uniform with the company logo and, it got worse. Not a lie, but not the full truth either. She left out the part about being a message. About being beaten specifically because she worked for Day One. Day One's driver found me and brought me here, she finished. Another partial truth. She couldn't bring herself to tell Steve that the man himself had carried her, bloodied and broken, through the rain. Steve's jaw tightened. And now we're staying in his penthouse? Why? What does he want? Always perceptive, her brother. Always seeing the angles she sometimes missed. He feels responsible, she said softly. Because I was wearing the company uniform. She felt rather than saw Day One shift behind them, his presence a tangible pressure in the room. Mr. Hale, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Your sister needs to rest. Sung Min will show you to your room. It's adjacent to hers. Steve turned his wheelchair, facing Day One squarely for the first time. Jovita held her breath, seeing her slight, damaged brother stare up at the powerful man who owned this fortress in the sky. "Thank you," Steve said, his voice steadier than she expected. "For helping my sister. But I need you to know, she's all I have left. If anything happens to her." He trailed off, the threat implicit but hollow. What could Steve possibly do against a man like Day One? Something like respect flickered across Day One's face. "Your sister is safe here," he said simply. "You have my word." The promise hung in the air, weighted with an authority that seemed to satisfy Steve. He nodded once, then turned back to Jovita. "I'll be right next door," he told her. "Get some rest. We'll talk more later." As Sungmin wheeled him away, Jovita caught Day One watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Not coldness. Not the blankness she was accustomed to. Something more complex, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Or perhaps, she realized with a jolt, as if he were seeing himself through her eyes. Living in Day One's home as a patient rather than a cleaner revealed things Jovita never would have seen otherwise. The penthouse operated with the precision of a Swiss watch, every staff member moving in careful orbits that rarely intersected but always complemented each other. Mrs. Kim, the cook, prepared meals that appeared at exactly the right moment without being asked for. Young-ho, the security chief, conducted silent sweeps of the residence at regular intervals, his presence reassuring rather than intimidating. Yuna managed it all with subtle efficiency, rarely raising her voice, communicating volumes with a lifted eyebrow or a slight nod. And at the center of this universe was Day One himself, moving through his domain with the quiet confidence of a man who never needed to question his place in the world. What surprised Jovita most was the way his staff related to him when they thought no one was watching. There was respect, certainly, back straightening when he entered a room, voices lowering deferentially when he spoke, but not the fear she had expected. Mrs. Kim scolded him for skipping meals, her wrinkled face creased with genuine concern. Young-ho shared quiet jokes with him in the security room, their laughter rumbling down the hallway. Even Yuna softened around him in unguarded moments, her professional facade slipping to reveal the sister beneath. "You're pushing yourself too hard again," Jovita overheard her telling him one evening. "Mother would be furious if she could see those circles under your eyes." "Mother would understand what's at stake," Day One had replied, but there was fondness in his tone, not rebuke. Most revealing were the nights. Unable to sleep from pain or worry, Jovita would wander the dark penthouse, careful not to disturb anyone. More than once, she found Day One in his office at 3 in the morning, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, poring over documents she wasn't supposed to see. Sometimes he spoke on the phone, voice low and controlled, switching fluently between Korean and Japanese. She understood enough to know that whatever business Kang Day One was in, it operated in shadows deep enough to drown in. Words like shipment and territory and arrangement took on ominous meanings in those midnight conversations. Once, she heard him say, "I don't negotiate with threats," his voice so cold it made her shiver despite the penthouse's perfect temperature. Another time, she glimpsed him standing on the balcony at dawn, smoking a cigarette as he stared out at the awakening city. His profile had been sharp against the rising sun, his expression weary in a way she never saw during daylight hours. For a moment, he had looked almost human, burdened, tired, alone. She had slipped away before he could catch her watching, but the image stayed with her. The man behind the shadow, carrying weights she couldn't see and didn't understand. If you're invested in finding out where this road leads, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. So, on the third day, a woman arrived at the penthouse. Young-hee Park walked with the crisp efficiency of someone who never wasted a movement. Her credentials, printed on the business card she handed to Jovita, listed specializations Jovita couldn't pronounce and affiliations with medical centers in Seoul, Tokyo, and New York. "Day One hired me for your brother," she explained, arranging equipment in the sunroom that had been converted into a therapy space overnight. Twice daily sessions. The newest techniques. Jovita stood in the doorway, watching as Young-hee worked with Steve. The therapist's hands were gentle but firm, guiding his body through movements he had struggled with for months. She adjusted his prosthetic, explaining how it had been fitted incorrectly, showing him how to prevent the sores that had plagued him since the amputation. And then, something miraculous happened. Steve laughed. It was a sudden, surprised sound that seemed to startle even him. Young-hee had said something Jovita couldn't hear, and her brother's face had lit up with genuine amusement, an expression Jovita hadn't seen in months. Maybe years. She backed away from the doorway before either of them could notice her watching, her throat tight with emotion. Leaning against the wall in the hallway, she pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to contain feelings too complex to name. Gratitude. Relief. And something darker, a twisting guilt at accepting help she hadn't asked for and couldn't repay. Jovita found Dae-won in his office later that afternoon. She knocked softly, then entered when he called permission. He sat behind his massive desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, making him look oddly scholarly despite the aura of power that surrounded him. I can't afford this, she said without preamble. He didn't look up from his papers. Did I ask you to pay? No, but, she stepped further into the room, frustration overriding her usual caution around him. You can't just fix everything. It doesn't work that way. It works exactly that way in my world. Well, I don't live in your world. Now he did look up, removing his glasses in a deliberate motion. At the moment, you do. Jovita inhaled sharply, pain shooting through her ribs at the sudden breath. Why are you doing this? All of it. The doctor. The therapy for Steve. Letting us stay here. I'm nobody to you. Something flickered across his face, a brief crack in his perfect composure. Perhaps that's the problem, Jovita, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Perhaps you've been a nobody for too long. The words hit her with unexpected force. She had spent years making herself small, invisible, insignificant. Had convinced herself it was safer that way. Easier. And now this man, this dangerous, powerful man, was looking at her as if she were something rare and valuable. Something worth protecting. It terrified her more than the fists that had broken her ribs. Before she could respond, his phone rang. Dae-won glanced at the screen, his expression hardening instantly. We'll continue this later, he said, the softness gone as if it had never existed. Please close the door on your way out. That night, Jovita woke to the sound of shouting. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back in their old apartment building, where arguments between neighbors filtered through paper-thin walls. Then she registered the silk sheets against her skin, the moonlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and remembered where she was. The shouting came from Dae-won's office. His voice, usually so controlled, raised in anger. Something shattered, glass breaking against a wall. She shouldn't investigate. Should turn over and go back to sleep. Should remember her place in this house. Instead, she slipped from bed, wincing as her ribs protested, and made her way down the darkened hallway. The door to Dae-won's office was closed, but light spilled from beneath it, along with raised voices, his and a woman's. You can't just declare war on him. That was Yuna, her carefully modulated voice now sharp with fear. He has twice your manpower. Connections we don't have. He crossed a line. Dae-won's voice was low but vibrating with rage. He touched what's mine. She's a housekeeper, Appa. Not family. Not. She is under my protection. That makes her mine. Something else shattered. Jovita jumped, her heart pounding. And this is exactly what Park wanted, Yuna continued, her voice slightly calmer now. To find your weakness. To make you emotional. To provoke you into acting rashly. I'm not being rash. I'm being clear. Actions have consequences. At what cost? How many of our people will die because your pride was wounded? Because he found the one person in your orbit you actually. The door flew open suddenly, startling Jovita backward. Yuna stormed out, her perfect composure fractured, face pale with anger or fear or both. She froze when she saw Jovita in the hallway. For a moment, the two women stared at each other. Then Yuna's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of calculation and something that looked almost like pity. They've threatened him again, she hissed, low enough that Day One couldn't hear from inside the office. Used you to get to him. And now he's going to do something stupid because of it. Her words hit Jovita like another punch. She wasn't just a message. She was a weapon aimed at Kang Day One's heart. A heart she hadn't even known existed until now. 1 week into her recovery, Jovita's ribs still ached with every breath, but the bruises on her face had faded from violent purple to sickly yellow-green. Dr. Jean had removed the stitches from her temple, leaving a thin red line that would eventually silver into a permanent reminder of that night in the alley. She was restless and used to idleness. The borrowed silk pajamas and soft slippers felt foreign against her skin. The endless hours with nothing to clean, nothing to fix, nothing to distract her from the growing tension in the penthouse, it all made her feel like a caged animal. That morning, she'd convinced Dr. Jean she was well enough to move around more freely. He'd reluctantly agreed, warning her to avoid lifting anything heavier than a book. Your body needs time, he'd said, his kind eyes serious behind his glasses. Pushing too hard now will only extend your recovery. So she'd taken to walking through the penthouse during the quiet afternoon hours when Steve was napping after his therapy sessions. It felt strange to move through these rooms without a cleaning cart, to look at the art on the walls instead of checking for dust, to sit on the furniture rather than vacuuming beneath it. It was during one of these walks that she returned to her guest room and found Day One there. He stood by the small writing desk where she'd left her few belongings, his broad back to the door, head bent slightly as he studied something in his hands. His posture was relaxed, shoulders looser than she typically saw them, as if he thought himself unobserved. Then she saw what he was holding. Her worn leather notebook, the one where she tracked every payment, every interest rate, every mounting dollar of debt. The notebook that had become both her prison and her prayer book, each entry a record of her slow drowning. $151,000 in stark black numbers, tallied and red allied as she tried to find a way out that didn't exist. Her stomach dropped. That's private. Day One didn't startle at her voice. Didn't rush to explain himself. He simply turned, the notebook still open in his hands, his expression unreadable. Your mother's medical bills, he said, flipping a page with careful fingers, as if the cheap paper might crumble at his touch. Degenerative myelopathy. 18 months of treatment. Hospital stay. Home care. He turned another page. Your brother's prosthetic. The accident. The amputation. Physical therapy he's not getting enough of. He looked up, those storm-gray eyes meeting hers directly. Why didn't you ask for help? The question was so absurd that Jovita laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that hurt her ribs and scraped against her throat. Ask who? Her voice was harder than she'd intended. The man who never looked at me. The world that didn't care when my mother died. The system that charged us $62,000 for my brother to walk again. She stepped fully into the room, anger giving her courage she wouldn't normally have around him. Should I have gone door to door in this building? Knocked on penthouses and begged the occupants for spare change? Excuse me, sir, my mother is dying and my brother lost his leg. Could you spare $100,000? You could have asked me. His voice remained calm, unmoved by her outburst. She stared at him, incredulous. I clean your toilets, she said flatly. I don't ask you for anything. That's not. I wash your sheets. I polish your floors. I dust your books. I do not ask the man who pays me to clean his house to also pay my personal debts. Pride, he said, the word not quite an accusation. It's admirable. But pride doesn't pay hospital bills. Neither does pity, she shot back. Something flickered in his eyes, a brief flash of what might have been surprise or respect. He closed the notebook carefully and set it back on the desk. Get some rest, he said, moving toward the door. Dr. Jean says you're pushing yourself too hard. As he passed her, his sleeve brushed against her arm, the lightest touch, probably unintentional. But it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. The dynamics between them shifted after that day. Day one no longer pretended she wasn't there. Instead, he sought her out. Casually appeared in rooms where she was sitting. Asked questions about her recovery. Brought her books when he saw her reading, real books, not the outdated magazines in the guest suite. First, it was a collection of Korean poetry she'd mentioned once to Yuna, not thinking anyone else was listening. Then a biography of Coco Chanel that made her wonder if he somehow knew about her abandoned design dreams. He began taking evening meals in the main dining room rather than his office, insisting that Jovita and Steve join him. The conversations were awkward at first, Steve wary, Jovita nervous, Day one formal, but gradually eased into something almost comfortable. He asked questions about her life before the debt. Before the pain. What had she studied? What did she enjoy? What had her childhood been like? Small questions that shouldn't have felt intimate but somehow did. She found herself answering truthfully. Telling him about her fashion design courses. About the small garden her mother had kept on their apartment balcony. About teaching Steve to read when he was 4 and she was 11, because their mother worked such long hours. In turn, he shared fragments of himself, never the full picture, but glimpses through a half-open door. His childhood in Busan before his family moved to Seoul. His studies in Tokyo and New York. His passion for traditional Korean architecture, evident in the Hanok-inspired elements throughout the penthouse. He never mentioned his business. Never explained the late-night phone calls or the men who sometimes arrived in dark suits with grave expressions. Never clarified what Yuna had meant when she said Jovita was being used as a weapon against him. But something was changing between them. Something undefined and dangerous, like ice forming over deep water, beautiful to look at, but with currents moving powerfully beneath. One night, unable to sleep, Jovita wandered out to the rooftop terrace. The space was a marvel of design, a garden 40 floors above the city, with carefully arranged Korean pines in ceramic pots, a small stream that circulated through a pump system, and comfortable seating position to take advantage of the view. She hadn't expected anyone else to be there at this hour, but a silhouette stood by the glass railing, Day one, unmistakable even in shadow, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. She hesitated, ready to retreat back inside. Join me, he said without turning around. Not a request. Jovita moved forward slowly, the night air cold against her skin as she settled into a chair near where he stood. From here, Seoul stretched before them like a galaxy of earthbound stars, the Han River a black ribbon cutting through the light. 40 floors above the city, the world looked small enough to hold in her palm. Why are you really helping me? She asked after a long silence. The question had burned inside her for days. The physical therapist for Steve. The specialist prosthetic being custom-made for him. The best medical care for her injuries. The luxury accommodations. It went far beyond employer responsibility. Day one didn't answer immediately. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the light catch and refract through it. Do you know what I do, Jovita? I've never asked. Smart girl. His lips curved in a faint smile. Let's just say I handle problems for people who can afford my solutions. You're a criminal, she said plainly, the words escaping before she could reconsider. To her surprise, he didn't look offended. I'm a businessman, he corrected mildly. The legality is flexible. He moved to the small table between them and picked up a crystal decanter. Whiskey? She nodded, though she rarely drank. Something about the night, the height, the cold air, the strange intimacy of darkness, made her brave. He poured a small measure into a second glass and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and something electric shot up her arm. A jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way his eyes lingered on her face. "In my world," he said quietly, returning to his position at the railing, "loyalty is everything. Protection goes both ways. You've been in my home for 19 months. Never stealing. Never gossiping. Never complaining about cleaning up messes that weren't yours." Jovita knew what messes meant. Blood on shirts. Broken glass after angry phone calls. Documents she wasn't supposed to see. "That makes you mine to protect," he continued, his eyes finding hers in the darkness. The possessive language should have bothered her. Should have set off warning bells. Instead, it sent another shiver through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. "I don't belong to anyone," she whispered. "Don't you?" His gaze was intent, searching. "We all belong to something, Jovita. To someone. To a family. To a cause. To a debt." She looked away first, unnerved by the truth in his words. By how much he seemed to understand about her. They sat in silence after that, drinking whiskey and watching the city lights flicker below them. The silence should have been uncomfortable, but it wasn't. There was an ease between them now that had never existed before. When Jovita finally returned to her room, she found herself wondering what it would be like to truly belong in Day One's world. Not as his housekeeper. Not as his charity case. As something else entirely. The next morning, Jovita checked her bank account out of habit, preparing for the familiar crush of anxiety. She sat at the small desk in her room, laptop open, fingers moving through the motions she'd performed hundreds of times. Type in the username. Enter the password. Click through to the summary page. Then stare in disbelief. The balance read, $0 debt remaining. Her heart stopped. She refreshed the page. The number didn't change. Paid in full. All $151,000. She checked her mother's hospital account. Paid. Her brother's medical bills. Paid. The high-interest loans she'd taken to cover rent when they'd fallen behind. Paid. Everything. All of it. Gone. Jovita's hands shook so badly she could barely close the laptop. Her mind raced, unable to process what she was seeing. This had to be a mistake. A system error. A cruel glitch that would be corrected within hours. But deep down, she knew. She ran through the penthouse, barefoot, still in her pajamas, hair loose around her shoulders, heedless of who might see her. Pain shot through her ribs with each step, but she barely felt it. She found him in his office, as she knew she would. He sat behind his massive desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, reviewing what looked like architectural plans. "What did you do?" Her voice shook. She couldn't tell if the emotion behind it was rage or gratitude or terror. Day One looked up calmly, as if he'd been expecting her. He removed his glasses and set them aside. "I fixed a problem. You had no right. I had every right." He stood, walked around the desk until he towered over her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, feel the heat radiating from his body. "You are in my home. Under my protection. That makes you and your burdens mine." Something snapped inside her. All the pride, all the independence, all the years of carrying her family's weight alone, it crystallized into a moment of pure, blind rage. She slapped him. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. His head barely moved from the impact. But his eyes darkened to something dangerous, pupils expanding until the gray was nearly swallowed by black. No one has touched me without permission in 12 years, he said softly. The kind of softness that preceded violence. No one except you. And the men who attacked you. His hand caught her wrist as she tried to back away, his grip firm but not painful. He held her there, not pulling her closer, not pushing her away. Just holding her in place while his eyes burned into hers. One of those groups will live to regret it, he whispered. Guess which one? The threat hung between them, ambiguous and terrifying. Did he mean the men who'd attacked her? Or did he mean her, standing in his office with the imprint of her hand still visible on his cheek? Her pulse raced beneath his fingers. She could feel it fluttering like a trapped bird, betraying her fear. Or perhaps it was betraying something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to name. Daewon's eyes dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, then returned to her eyes. He released her wrist slowly, deliberately, his fingers trailing along her skin in a touch that could have been accidental but wasn't. Go check on your brother, he said, his voice controlled again. Young-hee says he's making exceptional progress. The abrupt dismissal left her off balance. She backed away, rubbing her wrist where his touch still burned, and fled the office without another word. Only when she was safely back in her room did she realize she hadn't thanked him. Hadn't acknowledged what he'd done. $151,000. The weight of years. The burden that had bent her back and broken her spirit. Gone with the click of his fingers. And all he'd asked in return was her recognition of a simple, terrifying truth. She belonged to him now. 3 days of tense silence followed. Jovita moved through the penthouse like a ghost, avoiding Daewon while trying to process what he had done. $151,000, gone. The weight that had crushed her for years, erased with a single decision by a man who treated that amount like pocket change. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt unmoored. As if a chain had been unlocked only to reveal she'd forgotten how to walk freely. Steve noticed the change in her. What's wrong? He asked on the second night, when she picked at her dinner without eating. Your ribs hurting again? I'm fine, she lied. You're not. He reached across the table, taking her hand. Talk to me, Jovi. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. We always do. But how could she explain? That the debt was gone, but now she owed something she couldn't name to a man whose world operated by rules she didn't understand? Just tired, she said, squeezing his hand. The medicine makes me foggy. Steve didn't believe her, she could see it in his eyes, but he didn't press further. Meanwhile, Daewon disappeared for hours at a time, returning with tight expressions and conducting hushed phone calls behind closed doors. Rooms she had previously been welcome in suddenly became off-limits. The security presence around the penthouse doubled overnight. On the third morning, Yuna cornered Jovita in the kitchen. What have you done to my brother? She demanded, her perfect composure fractured by genuine concern. Nothing, Jovita said, startled by the direct confrontation. He's hunting Park Min-ho's men. Breaking a 12-year peace. And all because they touched you. Yuna's eyes narrowed, studying Jovita's face with uncomfortable intensity. Who are you to him? Jovita wished she knew the answer. I'm just his housekeeper, she said quietly. Yuna's laugh was brittle. No housekeeper has ever made Kang Daewon pay off their debts. No housekeeper has ever made him reckless. I didn't ask him to pay my debts, Jovita said, her voice sharper than intended. I didn't ask for any of this. Something in her tone must have convinced Yuna she was telling the truth. The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, her expression shifting from suspicion to resignation. It doesn't matter if you asked, she said, her voice softening. What matters is that he did it. And now Park knows he's found Daewon's weakness. I'm not his weakness. Then what are you? Yuna asked, the question hanging in the air as she turned and walked away. Jovita had no answer. That night, Jovita couldn't sleep. A storm lashed against the windows, rain streaking the glass like tears. Lightning periodically illuminated the city skyline, followed seconds later by thunder that seemed to shake the penthouse despite its solid construction. At 3 a.m., she heard the elevator doors open. She'd grown familiar with the sounds of the penthouse, which floorboards creaked, which doors whispered and which groaned, which footsteps belonged to which person. The elevator's soft chime, followed by the hydraulic hiss of its doors, meant someone had arrived from the ground floor. Curious, and restless from hours of sleeplessness, Jovita slipped from her bed. She pulled on a robe over her borrowed silk pajamas and stepped into the hallway. The penthouse was dark except for the security lights that glowed softly in the corners. Lightning flashed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, briefly illuminating the marble floors and modern furnishings in harsh white light. She moved silently toward the foyer, drawn by the sound of male voices, low, urgent, speaking Korean too rapidly for her limited understanding. As she rounded the corner, she froze. Daewon stood in the center of the entrance hall, his back to her. He was soaking wet, his white shirt plastered to his body, water pooling around his expensive leather shoes. But it wasn't the rain that made Jovita's breath catch. It was the dark stains spreading across his shirt. Stains that even in the dim light were unmistakably blood. Not small spots like she'd cleaned from his cuffs before. This was significant, covering his right sleeve, splattered across his collar, smeared on his hands. Young-ho stood beside him, speaking quietly, his own clothes similarly wet but unmarked by blood. His expression was grim, his posture tense. Then lightning flashed again, brighter this time, and Daewon turned, perhaps sensing her presence or catching sight of her reflection in one of the glass walls. Their eyes met across the marble foyer. He should have looked terrifying, this dangerous man with violence clinging to him like a second skin, blood on his hands, storm in his eyes. Instead, he looked tired. Human in a way she'd never seen before. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there that morning, and something about the way he held his right shoulder suggested pain he was trying to hide. "Are you hurt?" The question escaped her before she could think better of it. Daewon stared at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't understand. Young-ho's eyes widened slightly, darting between them before he quietly excused himself, leaving them alone in the dimly lit foyer. "You're asking if I'm hurt?" Daewon finally said, his voice rough with what might have been disbelief. "When I'm covered in another man's blood?" Jovita took a step forward, then another, drawn toward him despite every instinct for self-preservation. "Yes," she said simply. "Are you hurt?" Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor, a brief glimpse of vulnerability quickly masked. "No." He glanced down at his bloodied hands as if seeing them for the first time. "The blood isn't mine." The implication hung in the air between them. Not his blood. Someone else's. Someone who likely wasn't alive to miss it. "Did you kill them?" she whispered. "The men who attacked me? Would it matter if I did?" "Yes." "Why?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the metallic tang of blood and the rain on his skin. "They would have killed you if my driver hadn't found you. They beat you until your ribs broke. Because of me. Because you work for me. That doesn't give you the right to." "To what?" "Protect what's mine." His voice rose, echoing off the marble floors. "In my world, Jovita, there are consequences for crossing certain lines. Park Min-ho crossed one when he touched you." The possessiveness in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. "I'm not yours," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then why are you still here?" he challenged. "Your debt is paid. Your brother is receiving care. You could leave right now, and I wouldn't stop you." His words struck her like physical blows. She could leave. Walk out the door, take Steve, return to their tiny apartment. She was no longer bound by financial necessity. So why did the thought of leaving make her chest tighten with something like panic? The men who hurt you, Dae-won continued, his voice lowering to something quiet and dangerous, were sent by Park Min-ho. Not randomly. Not opportunistically. He knew you worked for me. He had you followed. He gave the order. Jovita wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the penthouse's perfect temperature. Why would he do that? To provoke me. To find my weakness. Dae-won's gaze was intense, unwavering. And he succeeded. The admission hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them seemed ready to voice. So what happens now? She asked. Now? Something dark and satisfied flickered across Dae-won's face. Now Park Min-ho learns that every action has consequences. That some lines can never be uncrossed. He stepped past her, heading toward the hallway that led to his private quarters. Get some sleep, Jovita, he said, his voice gentler than she expected. Tomorrow will be complicated. She should have let him go. Should have returned to her room. Should have remembered that the man walking away from her had blood on his hands, literally and figuratively. Instead, she called after him. Dae-won. He stopped but didn't turn. Thank you, she said quietly. For the debt. I should have said it before. His shoulders tensed, then relaxed. He gave a small nod, still not turning to face her, then continued down the hallway until he disappeared into the shadows. That night, lying in a bed that cost more than her mother's funeral, Jovita faced the truth she'd been avoiding. She didn't want to leave. Not because of the luxury. Not because of the debt. Not even because of the care Steve was receiving. But because whenever Kang Dae-won looked at her, really looked at her, she felt seen for the first time in years. Not as a housekeeper. Not as a caretaker. Not as a sister or daughter. As a woman. As someone who mattered. She had spent so long making herself small, invisible, insignificant. Had convinced herself it was safer that way. Easier. Now she found herself craving his gaze. Craving the way he said her name, like it was something precious. Craving the fierce protectiveness that should have frightened her but instead made her feel secure in a world that had never been safe. And that terrified her more than the blood on his hands ever could. The photo arrived the next morning. Young-ho delivered it personally, his expression grave. This was left at the security desk downstairs, he said, handing her a plain white envelope. It's addressed to you. No return address. No postage. Just her name in blocky handwriting on the front. Jovita stared at it, a chill running down her spine. No one knew she was here. No one except. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph of her walking in Dae-won's private garden, taken with what must have been a telephoto lens from outside the property's walls. She was wearing the gray slacks and sweater Yuna had lent her 3 days ago, her face turned slightly toward the camera, though she had no memory of seeing anyone watching. Written on the back in red ink was a message. A beautiful cleaner. Shame if she ended up like the last one. Jovita's blood went cold. She nearly dropped the photo. Dae-won appeared in the doorway as if summoned by her fear. What's wrong? Wordlessly, she held out the photograph. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took it from her hand, his expression darkening as he read the message on the back. His face, when he looked up, was carved from stone. Pack your things, he said, his voice eerily calm. Both you and your brother. We're leaving the penthouse. Now. Why? Fear made her voice shake. What does it mean, like the last one? His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw real fear there, not for himself, but for her. It means Park Min-ho just declared war. The journey to Dae-won's country estate took place in tense silence. They left before dawn. Jovita and Steve bundled into the back of a black SUV with windows so darkly tinted they couldn't see out. Daewon rode in a separate vehicle ahead of them, while Young-ho followed in a third. A convoy moving through the sleeping city like shadows. No one explained exactly what was happening or where they were going, only that they were no longer safe at the penthouse. The photograph had changed everything. Yuna had packed bags for them with ruthless efficiency. Clothes, toiletries, medications, all gathered and organized within 20 minutes. She'd been unnervingly calm, but Jovita had noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she zipped the final bag. "Has this happened before?" Jovita had asked her quietly, while Steve was in the bathroom. Yuna's eyes had met hers briefly. Not for 12 years. Now, as the SUV climbed steadily into the mountains outside Seoul, following winding roads that grew increasingly narrow, Steve squeezed Jovita's hand. "Are you going to tell me what's really happening?" he asked, his voice low. "Because this isn't about your mugging anymore, is it?" She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It's complicated. I'm not a child, Jovi." His eyes, so like their mother's, were steady and serious. "We're being taken to a safe house by a man who clearly has security teams and escape plans. I deserve to know why." Before she could answer, the SUV slowed, turning onto a gravel drive nearly hidden by dense pine trees. They passed through an unremarkable wooden gate that belied the sophisticated security cameras positioned discreetly among the branches above. The drive curved through the forest for nearly a kilometer before the trees suddenly opened, revealing a clearing and the estate beyond. Jovita's breath caught. Daewon's country home sprawled across a natural plateau halfway up the mountainside. Traditional Hanok architecture, sweeping tile roofs, wooden beams, paper doors, blended with subtle modern elements. The main house formed a perfect square around a central courtyard, with smaller buildings arranged harmoniously throughout the grounds. Cherry trees, still bare in the winter air, lined stone pathways that wound through meticulously maintained gardens. Koi ponds reflected the gray morning sky. And everywhere, guards, positioned at strategic points throughout the property, their presence professional rather than intrusive. "No one knows about this place," Daewon told Jovita as they stepped from their vehicles. He spoke quietly, close to her ear, his breath warming her cheek. "Not Park Min-ho. Not his men. No one." "Then how can you be sure we're safe?" she asked. "Because this isn't in my name." His eyes scanned the perimeter, assessing. "It belonged to my grandmother. The property records still show her as owner, though she's been dead for 20 years. Even my closest associates believe I sold it after she passed." The main house was even more beautiful inside. Traditional Hanji paper walls glowed softly in the morning light. Heated floors radiated gentle warmth through their socks. Antique furniture, pieces that belonged in museums, arranged with perfect simplicity. Yet Jovita didn't miss the modern touches hidden within the traditional aesthetics. The nearly invisible security panels. The reinforced glass in the windows. The subtle bulges under the jackets of the staff who bowed respectfully as they entered. Steve whistled as they moved into the central hall, his wheelchair rolling silently over polished wooden floors. "You really are someone important, aren't you?" he asked Daewon with newfound respect. Daewon's smile was tight. "Important enough to have dangerous enemies." They settled into adjacent rooms in the east wing. Jovita's overlooked a small pond where koi fish swam in lazy circles despite the winter chill. Paper lanterns hung from the eaves outside, swaying gently in the mountain breeze. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, tension hung in the air like the threat of lightning before a storm. Daewon disappeared immediately into what appeared to be a study, closing the sliding doors behind him. Urgent phone calls followed, his voice too muffled for Jovita to make out the words. Young-ho stationed guards at regular intervals throughout the property, each man armed and watchful. Yuna arrived 2 hours later with additional supplies, her face drawn and serious as she supervised their arrangement. No one explained. No one needed to. The urgency in every movement, the constant vigilance, the hushed conversations that stopped whenever Jovita or Steve approached, they all spoke to a danger that had followed them from Seoul. The day passed in strange suspension. Steve received his physical therapy in one of the smaller buildings, converted hastily into a treatment room. Jovita wandered the grounds, always aware of eyes watching her, always within sight of the main house. As dusk settled over the mountain, painting the sky in deep purples and blues, she found herself drawn to the koi pond. Stone lanterns illuminated the water, where fish created ripples of silver and gold against the darkening surface. She sat on a smooth boulder beside it, watching the patterns form and dissolve. That was where day one found her after night had fully fallen, the mountain air crisp with early winter's bite. "You should be inside," he said. "It's not safe out here after dark." I needed space to think. She didn't look at him, eyes still fixed on the dancing reflections. "Steve is asleep. The medication for his leg always knocks him out." Day one hesitated, then sat beside her on the boulder. Close enough that their shoulders almost touched, but not quite. Heat radiated from his body in the cold air. "There was no last one," he said without preamble, his voice low and steady. Park Min-ho was bluffing. Now she did look at him, confusion furrowing her brow. "Then why did we leave?" He stared out at the water, his profile sharp against the lantern light. The scar along his eyebrow looked deeper in the shadows, a reminder of violence survived. "Because 12 years ago, Park's father used someone I cared about to get to me. My fiancée, Soo-jin." His voice roughened on the name, as if he hadn't spoken it aloud in years. "I was 25. Too confident. Too careless." Jovita waited, heart pounding. In all their conversations, he had never mentioned a fiancé. Never hinted at a past that included someone he'd planned to marry. "We met at university in Tokyo," he continued, his eyes still fixed on the water. "She was studying international law. Brilliant. Fearless. The daughter of a diplomat who didn't approve of my family's business interests. But she didn't care." He smiled faintly, the expression tinged with old pain. "We were engaged for 8 months. Planning the wedding. Planning a future. I thought I could keep her separate from my world, protect her from the realities of what I did." His hands clenched against his thighs. Park Young-ho, Min-ho's father, was expanding his territory. Challenging my father's control of certain import channels. There were negotiations. They broke down. She could hear what he wasn't saying. The violence that must have followed. The escalation. One night, Soo-jin didn't come home from her law firm. I wasn't worried at first, she often worked late. But then I received a photo. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. "Similar to the one Park Min-ho sent you. Except Soo-jin was tied to a chair, eyes wide with fear." Jovita felt cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "They didn't just kill her, Jovita." His voice finally broke. "They made me watch. Used her to force concessions from my father. Territory. Money. Pride. And when they had what they wanted, they killed her anyway." "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate. "After that, I made sure there was never anyone they could use against me again. I kept everyone at a distance. Staff. Family. Everyone." His eyes finally found hers in the darkness. "Until you." "Until me," she echoed softly. His eyes held hers, searching, intense. "Park Min-ho has been waiting for me to make the same mistake his father exploited. To care about someone who could become a weakness. For 12 years, I've been careful. Cold. Distant. Why me? She asked, the question that had burned inside her for days. I'm nobody. A cleaner with too much debt and not enough sleep. Because you looked at me and saw a man, not a monster, he said simply, the honesty in his voice stealing her breath. The night I came home covered in blood, you asked if I was hurt. Not what I had done. Not who I had hurt. If I was hurt. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining with surprising gentleness. For 19 months, you moved through my life, quiet and careful and kind. Carrying burdens that would break most people. Never complaining. Never breaking. His voice softened. How could I not see you, Jovita? How could I not want to protect you? The words hung between them, weighted with a truth neither had acknowledged until this moment. And then he kissed her. Not gently. Not carefully. But like a drowning man finding air after years beneath the surface. His lips were warm despite the cold night, firm against hers, one hand rising to cup her face while the other tightened around her fingers. He tasted of coffee and something distinctly him, something she had no name for but immediately recognized. She should have pushed him away. Should have remembered who he was. What he'd done. The blood she'd seen on his hands. The danger that surrounded him like a second skin. Instead, she kissed him back. Her free hand curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, her body responding with a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. For 19 months, she had made herself invisible. Had trained herself not to want, not to need, not to feel. Now everything she'd suppressed roared to life at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, his forehead rested against hers. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, his touch reverent. I should have stayed away from you, he whispered. I'm not a good man, Jovita. I know who you are, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. I've always known. And yet you're still here. I'm still here. He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a claim. Then he helped her to her feet, his hand warm and secure around hers. We should go inside, he said. It's getting colder. They walked back to the main house together, her fingers laced with his, the mountain silence wrapping around them like a cloak. For the first time in years, Jovita felt a strange peace. As if she had been moving toward this moment her entire life without knowing it. That night, she slept more deeply than she had in months, her dreams free of debt collectors and hospital rooms. Free of the weight that had pressed on her chest for so long. She didn't know then that peace was the most dangerous illusion of all. The gunshots woke her at 4 a.m. Jovita bolted upright in bed, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then reality crashed in as she registered the sounds, shouting, breaking glass, the thunder of footsteps on wooden floors. She had barely swung her legs over the side of the bed when the door slid open violently. Day One stood there, face pale in the dim light, a gun in his right hand. He wore the same clothes from earlier, suggesting he hadn't slept. His eyes swept the room quickly, assessing, before locking onto her. They found us, he said, voice tight with controlled fear. Park's men. They're here. How? She began, struggling to process what was happening. There's a traitor. Someone told them. He crossed to her in 3 long strides, pulling her from the bed with his free hand. There's a tunnel under the east wing. Take Steve and go. My driver is waiting by the exit. Another burst of gunfire, closer this time. Shouting in Korean. The sound of something heavy falling. What about you? She grabbed his arm, fear making her voice shake. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a goodbye. Jovita, he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. Some debts can only be paid one way. The meaning crashed over her. He wasn't planning to escape. He was planning to stay. To fight. To buy them time. No, she said fiercely. You're coming with us. I can't. His expression hardened. If I run, this never ends. Park will keep coming. Keep using you against me. I have to finish this. He pressed a hard, desperate kiss to her mouth, then pushed her toward the door. Go. Please. If you stay, they'll use you to destroy me. And I can't watch that happen. Not again. As he turned to leave, she grabbed his arm. Don't you dare die for me, Kang Dae-won. His smile was sad. Too late. And then he was gone, walking toward the sound of men who had come to kill him. For a heartbeat, Jovita stood frozen, torn between following him and doing as he'd asked. Then Steve's safety crystallized in her mind, giving her clarity. She ran to her brother's room, finding him already awake, struggling to get into his wheelchair. What's happening? He demanded, eyes wide with fear. We need to go. Now. She helped him into the chair, grabbed the emergency bag Yuna had prepared for them, and pushed him toward the hallway Dae-won had indicated. Young-ho appeared at the end of the corridor, face grim, a gun in each hand. This way, he said urgently. Quickly. More gunfire. Closer. The sound of breaking wood. Men shouting orders. Jovita pushed Steve's chair, following Young-ho through a series of turns until they reached what looked like a storage closet. The security chief pushed aside shelving to reveal a hidden door. The tunnel leads to a garage about half a kilometer away, he explained, handing Jovita a flashlight. Sungmin is waiting with a car. He'll take you somewhere safe. What about Dae-won? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Young-ho's expression softened slightly. He's making sure you have time to escape. He's going to get himself killed, she whispered. Perhaps. Young-ho helped maneuver Steve's wheelchair into the tunnel entrance. But he's made his choice. And he chose you. As the door closed behind them, sealing them in the dark tunnel with only the flashlight's beam, Steve looked up at his sister. You're in love with him, he said. Not a question. Jovita didn't answer. She couldn't. The realization was too new, too raw, too terrifying to voice aloud. Instead, she pushed his chair forward, away from the sounds of violence echoing behind them. Away from the man who had changed everything. Away from a truth she wasn't ready to face. That sometimes love costs more than debt ever could. Jovita got Steve to the tunnel, but she couldn't leave. Couldn't abandon Dae-won to face his enemies alone. The underground passage was narrow and damp, lit only by the thin beam of her flashlight. The air smelled of earth and concrete, cool against her face as they moved deeper into the darkness. Steve's wheelchair barely fit, scraping occasionally against the rough walls. They'd gone perhaps 100 meters when Jovita stopped. What are you doing? Steve asked, twisting in his chair to look up at her. She stood frozen, flashlight beam trembling in her hand, listening to the distant sounds of gunfire echoing through the tunnel. Each shot could be the one that killed Dae-won. Each moment that passed could be his last. I can't, she whispered. I can't just leave him. Steve reached for her hand. Jovi, there's nothing you can do. Those are men with guns up there. I know. She squeezed his fingers. But I need to try. Decision crystallizing, she knelt beside his chair. The tunnel is straight from here. Sungmin is waiting at the end with a car. She pressed the flashlight into his hand. If I'm not there in 20 minutes, tell him to leave without me. Jovi, no. But she was already running back the way they'd come, guided by memory and the faint glow from emergency lights spaced along the ceiling. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out Steve's calls for her to come back. She had spent her entire life running toward responsibility. Toward family. Toward duty. Always putting others first, making herself small and invisible to care for those who needed her. This time was different. This time, she was running towards something she wanted. Something that was hers. The hidden door at the end of the tunnel was still unlocked. Jovita slipped through it silently, emerging into the storage closet. The sounds of fighting were louder now, shouts in Korean, the crash of breaking furniture, occasional gunfire. She moved cautiously through the silent corridors of the East Wing, barefoot and still in her sleep clothes, pressing herself against walls at corners, peering around carefully before proceeding. The training from years of avoiding notice in Day One's penthouse served her well now. Following the sounds of conflict, she made her way toward the central courtyard. As she neared the main hall, a body sprawled across her path, one of Park's men, unseeing eyes staring at the ceiling, blood pooling beneath him. She swallowed hard and stepped around him. Through a partially open door, she could see into the main hall. The beautiful space was now a battlefield. Furniture overturned for cover. Bullet holes in the delicate paper walls. Broken glass glittering on the polished floor. She found them in the center of the chaos. Day One stood with his back to one of the wooden support columns, blood seeping from a wound in his left shoulder. His gun was pointed at Park Min-ho, who stood 5 meters away, a slight man with cruel eyes and a gun of his own aimed at Day One's heart. 3 of Park's men surrounded him, their weapons trained on Day One. Young-ho lay on the ground nearby, clutching his side, his face twisted in pain. Finally, Park was saying, his voice smooth with satisfaction. 12 years I've waited to see you broken, Kong. You'll wait longer, Day One spat, though blood trickled from a cut on his temple, running down the side of his face. Park smiled. I don't think so. Not when I have the perfect leverage. He turned, and saw Jovita standing in the doorway. His smile widened. Right on time. No. Day One lunged forward, but Park's men grabbed him, forcing him back against the column. One struck him across the face with a pistol, splitting his cheek open. Park gestured with his gun. Come here, girl. Jovita stepped into the room, hands raised, heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her eyes met Day One's, saw the desperation there, the fear that had nothing to do with his own safety. Let him go, she said, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. Jovita, don't, Day One's voice broke on her name, raw with emotion. Park laughed. So the rumors are true. The great Kong Day One, brought to his knees by a cleaning girl. He moved toward her, each step deliberate, until he stood close enough that she could smell his cologne, something cheap and cloying. How does it feel, Kong? To watch someone you love die? Like I watched my brother die at your hands? Jovita didn't move as Park pressed the gun to her temple, the metal cold against her skin. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to this single moment. She looked at Day One, this complicated, dangerous man who had paid her debts, healed her brother, and somehow stolen her heart. Blood ran down his face, soaked his shoulder, but his eyes never left hers. Close your eyes, she whispered to him. Instead, he smiled at her. A real smile. Soft and sad and full of everything they hadn't had time to say. And that's when she moved. The self-defense classes her mother had insisted on. The ones she'd taken religiously after her mother died, walking home alone at night through dangerous neighborhoods. They came back in a rush of muscle memory. Elbow to ribs. Palm to nose. Twist of the wrist. Park hadn't expected resistance from a cleaning girl. His grip on the gun loosened in shock when her elbow connected with his solar plexus. She struck upward with the heel of her hand, feeling cartilage crunch as his nose broke. His finger tightened reflexively on the trigger, but she had already twisted his wrist away from her head. The gun fired, the bullet embedding in the ceiling as it clattered from his grasp to the floor. What happened next happened so fast Jovita barely saw it. Day One, taking advantage of the momentary shock, broke free from the men holding him. Young-ho, despite his wound, surged up from the floor with a hidden weapon. More of Day One's men poured in from side entrances that must have been concealed, catching Park's remaining forces from behind. When it was over, Park Min-ho knelt on the floor, blood streaming from his broken nose, Day One's gun pressed to his forehead. "Do it," Park hissed, hatred burning in his eyes. "Finish it." Day One's finger tightened on the trigger, his face a mask of cold fury. 12 years of grief and rage focused into this single moment of vengeance. "Don't," Jovita said quietly. He looked at her, eyes questioning. "If you kill him, this never ends," she said. "There will always be someone else seeking revenge." For a long moment, no one breathed. The air hung heavy with blood and gunpowder and possibility. Then Day One lowered the gun. "Get him out of my sight," he told his men. "Make sure he understands what happens if he ever comes near what's mine again." As they dragged Park away, Day One crossed to Jovita in 3 long strides and pulled her against him, heedless of his injuries. "You could have died," he whispered into her hair, his arms tight around her as if afraid she might disappear. "So could you," she replied, feeling his heartbeat, strong and rapid against her cheek. He pulled back, framed her face with his hands. "Don't ever do that again." She smiled up at him, this man who had moved from shadow to substance in her life. "Don't ever tell me what to do." And then he laughed, a real laugh that transformed his face into something young and unburdened and beautiful. 3 months later, Jovita stood on the rooftop terrace of Day One's penthouse, watching Seoul glitter below like a carpet of stars. So much had changed. Steve was walking with a new prosthetic, the best money could buy. He'd returned to his engineering classes, a driver taking him each day. Jovita no longer cleaned the penthouse. Other hands polished the marble floors and arranged the flowers. Instead, she was studying design again, the dream she'd abandoned when her mother got sick. Her sketches now covered a desk in what had once been Day One's home office, but was now a shared space. Her first collection would debut at Seoul Fashion Week in the fall, backed by a foundation that Day One had established to support designers from underprivileged backgrounds. And Day One, he was changing too. Shifting his business toward legitimate enterprises. Making peace with old enemies where possible. The criminal would never entirely disappear, some shadows run too deep to be fully erased, but he was building something that could exist in the light. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming up behind her, arms sliding around her waist. "How strange life is," she said, leaning back against his chest. 19 months I was invisible in your home. And now you're the most visible thing in my world," he finished. She turned in his arms, looking up at the face that had once terrified her and now felt like home. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Getting involved with a cleaning girl with too much baggage?" His hand cupped her cheek, thumb tracing the faint scar left by that first punch in the alley, the punch that had changed everything. "Jovita," he said softly, "you were never just a cleaning girl. You were the woman brave enough to see the man behind the monster. And for that, I would pay any price." As his lips met hers, she knew that some debts could never be repaid. And some, like the debt of being truly seen after a lifetime of invisibility, you carried gladly, forever. If this story touched you, if you believe that sometimes love finds us in the most unexpected places, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Was there a moment in this story that really moved you? Or a character you connected with? I read every comment and love hearing your thoughts. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. See you in the next video.